When we imagine language, we usually think of sounds that flow together, from constrained consonants to beautiful vowels. Sometimes, some sounds and languages can be very unique and alien. However, very few, under a dozen, use a specific type of sound that most would not consider to be useful for full communication. Today, we will explore the most popular of these languages that use whistling as speech. I am, of course, talking about Silbo Gomero, located on the island of La Gomera of the Canary Islands. We will explore who these people are and why this form of communication is very common there, and also what it sounds like. Welcome to the LangInfo podcast, where we have an adventure into the history of dying and extinct languages, and sometimes even rare tongues. I am Matthew Malcolm, today's host. Every episode, we take the time to search into a specific language, its history, orthography, geography, and more. We learn why these languages are dying, became extinct, and or what they evolved into. We imagine how the peoples of these languages lived and who they were. Join me, if you will, and let's learn about a new language. Language, or the word we use for human communication, has existed since the dawn of man. We have always used some form of sounds or actions to be able to tell others of our kind of dangers and resources. Language usually consists of sounds that flow together and form words, which form sentences and more. These sounds flow together with constrained consonants and sonorous vowels. In English, we have some unique sounds, the most prominent ones being the th and th being represented by a th. In Russian, they have an y, which may sound like I, but it's not quite the same. French also has many nasal vowels, while some languages have even more unique sounds. There is a category of languages that use whistling as a form of communication. There are under a dozen of them, most being small and unknown to most of the world. To give some examples, we have the Afro-Asiatic Bensanan language in Ethiopia, the Pirahan language of the Amazon jungles, and the Silbo Gomero language on the island of La Gomera. All of these examples only use whistling as communication. Perhaps some of the other examples will be future episodes. Today's focus will only be Silbo Gomero. Silbo Gomero can be translated as Gomeran whistle. This has to do with the fact that the native origin of this language is the island of La Gomera, which itself is a part of the Canary Islands off the coast of northwestern Africa. There will be a map of the islands on our Instagram page. These islands are a Spanish autonomous community. Now, in Spanish politics, and in this case just Spain itself, it is basically one of the 17 first-level political and administrative divisions of Spain. This is kind of like states in the United States, but with heavy stress on the kind of. The Canary Islands can basically be considered a territory of Spain, like how Hawaii is to the US. It is not attached, but it is considered a part, at least in the political scene. However, this show is not about political inner workings, so let's get back on track. Another name that is given and is more common for the language is El Silbo, or the whistle. For the remainder of the audio, I will refer to Silbo Gomero as simply El Silbo for simplicity. Just know that it is much more common to refer to it as such. Speakers of El Silbo actually have been given a name in Spanish. They are sometimes referred to as silbador, which means whistler. Long before the islands were conquered by the Spanish, another collection of people inhabited the islands. These people are referred to as the Guanche. It is believed that these people arrived to the archipelago sometime in the first millennium BC. They are known as the only civilization of the islands until the European settlers arrived. After the Spanish conquest of the islands by the Crown of Castile in the early 1400s, many of the natives were wiped out by settlers and disease. Whoever remained, much like the Native Americans of the Americas, interbred with the new settlers. Many of the Guanche traditions are still celebrated to this day. Their language, which linguists claim to closely resemble Berber, was simple enough to actually have a whistled variant. This is where El Silbo got its name from and began. The conquest of the islands began in 1402. After the expedition of Jean de Betancourt and Gadife de la Salle, the Kingdom of Castile called for colonization of the islands. They invaded Lanzarote and Fuerteventura with ease since many of the people on those islands already faced starvation and agricultural difficulties. This resulted in them surrendering quickly to the Spanish. Soon, the remaining islands would fall to the conquest, and, with them, the Canaries would be under Spanish rule around 1496. Later, in the 16th century, then called Silbo would adopt itself with Castilian Spanish. Slowly becoming more popular on La Gomera, by the 17th century, it would be widely spoken throughout the island. However, this was not the only remnant of Silbo. The island of El Hierro had a flourishing community of whistlers at the end of the 19th century. Soon, though, it would become nearly extinct on the island by 1976. Now, modern-day El Silbo is still flourishing, with reasons that I will explain soon. It has, however, had its ups and downs in its history. In the 1950s, the language had lost much of its usage. This is due to a few factors, one of which was economic decline on the island. This forced whistlers to move elsewhere to seek better jobs, which would mean that El Silbo would not be understood by others. Another problem was the invention of the telephone. You see, one major advantage of El Silbo was that it was able to be heard across a distance of up to 5 kilometers. To put that into perspective, it would be about 3 miles. This means that it was a lot louder than normal speech, even louder than yelling or screaming. This was used to have communication with far parts of the island without having to travel far. Since the telephone allowed for even greater distance communication without everyone within a 5-kilometer radius eavesdropping in on the conversation, it resulted in El Silbo not really having any practical purpose anymore. Another problem was that during the period of the 1960s and 1980s, the Canary Islands were moving away from being agricultural to a more modern society. This meant that El Silbo was actually seen as being a poor, rural, and peasant-like language by the middle class. They did not want their descendants to learn the whistled language, but instead the regular spoken language, Canarian Spanish. As a result of these problems, there was a good chance that by the 21st century, El Silbo could have been an extinct language. However, there were reasons that people can still whistle in El Silbo today. By the late 1990s, ideologies shifted away from the ideas of the poor peasantry versus the middle class. More communities on La Gomera started a process of language revitalization with El Silbo. Language revitalization is a process to attempt to halt or reverse the death and extinction of a language. This can also be used to bring back a dead language. One example of this is with the Hebrew language. I will save the full story of Hebrew's revival for another episode, but in short, Hebrew was revived by the idea of Zionism and brought the language back as a spoken and literary lingua franca. Back to El Silbo, local communities started to bring back the usage of the language. By 1999, further revitalization efforts were proposed. Education policies and legislative protection of El Silbo came into effect. A combination of initiatives from the community and policies implemented by the authorities saw El Silbo being revived and maintained as a cultural asset. Another group would go on to protect the language even more. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, also known as UNESCO, helped document and preserve the language. This United Nations specialized agency aims to protect, preserve, and document many traditions of smaller communities of the world. They created the masterpieces of the oral and intangible heritage of humanity in 2001. This is a collection of the world's rare yet beautiful traditions and practices. Since many more traditions and practices were being revived, UNESCO has claimed that their goal has been achieved. Now, the previous collection turned into the representative list of the intangible cultural heritage of humanity, being a list of many, many traditions and practices around the world. Many people in La Gomera still speak El Silbo, but their expression of the language deviates in minor ways, which shows the different origins of the whistler. As reported in 2009 by UNESCO, all the people living on La Gomera understand the language, but only those born before 1950 and the younger generations who attended school since 1999 can speak the language. Those born before 1950 were taught the language by their elders in their homes, and those who have attended or are attending school since 1999 were taught the language formally in school. Those born between 1950 and 1980 understand the language but are unable to speak it, as the language was hardly used and negatively viewed during their time of language acquisition. Language acquisition is the process of development where we learn to perceive and comprehend language as well as be able to speak and create sentences. El Silbo is not only used between Gomerans. Visitors to the island have the opportunity to be exposed to the whistle language too. Many restaurants provide demonstrations of El Silbo to clients. Minister of Tourism of La Gomera, Fernando Mendez, asserted that El Silbo is essential to the tourism industry of the island. Now, I will play a recording of a person whistling in El Silbo. According to different studies, El Silbo has 2 to 4 vowels and 4 to 10 consonants. The language itself is actually a whistled form of Canary Spanish, which is a variant of Spanish that is similar to Andalusi Spanish. El Silbo replaces each vowel and consonant with a different whistle sound. Whistles are distinguished according to their pitch and length. As with many other whistle languages, El Silbo works by sort of retaining the spoken variant with whistles. El Silbo is a complex language to learn. It requires physical precision and strength of the body parts used in the articulation of the language. This can only be achieved with lots of practice. El Silbo uses the tongue, lips, and even the hands of the whistler. You see, when people use vocals to speak a language, the mouth cavity is capable of emitting many frequencies that we hear. In contrast, El Silbo is limited to only a single basic pitch, one that is between 1000 and 3000 Hz. Keep in mind that normal speech is only between 80 and 255 Hz depending on the person. The physical precision comes from the skill of the whistler being able to vary the frequencies at different speeds and to start and stop the production of the sounds. This technique is handed down within La Gomera's community, with unchanged teaching methods that date back to the late 19th century. The same pitch can represent many sounds, so it has much fewer phonemes than Spanish, meaning that there is less distinction in each sound and word. This also means that communication in Silbo can be ambiguous at times. Context and appropriate choice of words are then important for full effective communication. High frequency whistling represents I and E, while low frequency represents A, O, and U. It is said that any other vowels cannot be distinguished due to the limitations of whistling versus speech. A silent pause in the continuity translates as voiced G, while no pause is just K. The versions of dental, palatal, and fricative sounds are distinguished by the sharpness and speed of the whistle. This gives classification to around 8 sounds in the consonant family. The representation of S is actually treated simply, a broken, high-pitched whistle. This is similar to the sound in normal speech too. There are a few other points I want to mention before we head into the conclusion. El Silbo has been used in the media in a very special manner. Filmmaker and photographer Francesca Phillips wrote and directed a 26-minute documentary on the usage of the language on La Gomera. This was titled Written in the Wind and was released in 2009. Romanian filmmaker Corneliu Porumboiu directed the 2019 film The Whistlers, in which the language is featured prominently. These are just 2 of the many examples of media using the language. As we can see, Silbo Gomero has had a fascinating history and has a long life ahead of it. With all the protections and media representations it has and will have, El Silbo and its spirit will live on for many generations to come. Perhaps it will evolve into something even greater. However, only time will tell. I hope you all enjoyed and learned something new on this episode of the LangInfo podcast. Undergoing this research, I certainly did. If you want to listen to more, follow this podcast on Instagram at LangInfoPod. This is where you can also view photos of what I discuss in the audios. You can also give a rating on your preferred podcast library. I truly appreciate it. And with that, I will hopefully see you all again for the next episode. Goodbye and take care, as always.